Okay. So, yes, Trump had an absolute right under the First Amendment to say anything he wanted to about the 2020 election. But he went beyond speech to conduct. Speech is protected. Conduct is not always, not all speech is protected either, frankly. Um, but I'm not going to go too far down that road. The things that Donald Trump was saying about the 2020 election are very, very likely protected speech in this case. But again, he moved on towards conduct. And I get a lot of comments. I got a lot of comments today um, from people. And look, I get not everybody goes to law school and not everybody knows what this stuff is. But people hear a term or they get a talking point and, you know, I get a comment and like they think it's a gotcha kind of thing. It's like, no, no, you're wrong. So I got a lot of comments last night and today saying, haha, this was protected speech under the First Amendment. And half of that sentence would be spelled wrong. And today it was, haha, it was expressive conduct and that is protected. I'm like, no, expressive conduct. Let me see here. Is behavior which can include speech, but it can include behavior that is designed to convey a message, like burning a flag or burning a draft card or something like that. But, you can't express your distaste for racism and racists by shooting and killing a member of the Klan. That is illegal. That is conduct. It is expressive, but it is illegal because it's murder. So the First Amendment has as much to do with this case as the Presidential Records Act has to do with the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, which is to say nothing. It has nothing to do with it at all. So when courts are looking at this kind of stuff, expressive conduct, they're looking at, was the conduct actually designed to convey a message? Or was the conduct designed to kind of convey a message, but actually to achieve another end at the end of the process? And here, Donald Trump didn't set up fake electors in 7 states because he wanted to express his dismay at the 2020 election. He did that because he wanted to remain in power. He did that because he wanted to overturn the election results. That is not expression. That is conduct. That conduct is illegal. Now, second defense that we've been hearing a lot about. Trump relied on his attorneys. Well, he's going to throw Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman under the bus. Co-conspirator 1 and co-conspirator 2. And saying I relied on my attorneys is like it's pretty damn close to saying, "Oh, I didn't know that was against the law." Everybody knows it's against the law to overturn election results because otherwise this wouldn't be the first time it's happened in 250 years. It's a dumb defense. It's coupled with the fact that Rudy Giuliani, who's been disbarred in 2 jurisdictions, and John Eastman is being disbarred in California. But then people were like, well, isn't the fact that they're being disbarred evidence of the fact that they lied to him? Well, they're being disbarred because of what they did in the 2020 election, because of what they did. And Donald Trump can't use as a defense, I relied on the opinions of these 2 attorneys, neither of whom were employed by the government, when he had the entire FBI, the entire DOJ, and the entire Office of White House Counsel and all of the attorneys in those places in his office on a daily basis saying there is no evidence the election was stolen. There is no evidence the election was stolen. Contradicting Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman every single day. So those defenses are going nowhere. All right, let's get into the thing here. Paragraph 1, page 1. I love this. The first paragraph is 2 sentences. The defendant, Donald J. Trump, was the 45th president of the United States and a candidate for re-election in 2020. The defendant lost the 2020 election. stated as fact. Paragraph 2, despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. And so he went on this whole campaign of spreading lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. Those claims were false, and Donald Trump knew those claims were false. Again, stated as fact. Paragraph 3, the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim, falsely, that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts and audits, which he did in Arizona and Wisconsin, or by filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures, which they did 63 times, and they lost 62 of those cases. And the 61st case in Pennsylvania that they won was on an issue so minor that it really didn't matter. Indeed, defendant did a lot of these things. But it says his efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly unsuccessful. Paragraph 4. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In doing so, the defendant perpetrated 3 criminal conspiracies. It's actually 5, but we'll get into that. So, paragraph 3 is First Amendment. Yes, First Amendment all the way. You're allowed to do this, First Amendment. Paragraph 4 is like, he got into conduct that's not legal, and that cuts off his First Amendment rights. Conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, presidential votes, conspiracy to corruptly obstruct or impede the congressional proceeding on January 6th to certify, conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted in violation of another code section. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust the defendant was creating through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud, targeted the bedrock foundation of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of a presidential election. Okay, so count 1, conspiracy to defraud the United States. So again, we're going to be in count 1 almost the entirety of this video. The allegations, so the conspiracy from on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th, 2021, so about 10 weeks, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators, known and unknown to the grand jury, to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat. I'm sure it's an accident that rhymes. The lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. Purpose of the conspiracy. The purpose of the conspiracy was to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the federal government function by which those results are collected, counted, and certified. That is a powerful sentence. Hang on one second. I got to grab a Coke. Then we start getting into the description of the co-conspirators 1 through 6. And I'm not going to read the descriptions. Just know that number 1 is Giuliani, number 2 is John Eastman, number 3 is Sidney Powell, number 4 is Jeffrey Clark, number 5 is Kenneth Chesebro, and it's being reported that number 6 is senior campaign consultant and frequent MSNBC guest Boris Epshteyn. So the federal government function, next section. It talks about presidential elections. I'm not going to read it. It's boring. Manner and means, page 5, paragraph 10. So the conspiracy to defraud the government, they used. Let me see here. 1 second. All right, so here we cover all 5 of these conspiracies. I should have kept that pad handy. So the first one is use knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislators and election officials to subvert their legitimate election results. And Trump and his folks, his people, including Mark Meadows, did this across several states. Most notably Georgia, the phone call with Ben Raffensperger. The second one, Trump and his co-conspirators then organized fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws. Now, again, this was John Eastman and Kenneth Chesebro driving the bus on this one. I want to reiterate here. Everybody on the left loves talking about the fact that Donald Trump won the 2020 election by more than 7 million votes. We don't elect presidents in the United States with a popular vote. We elect them state by state with the Electoral College because, we had to appease slave owners. So it goes state by state. Well, of that 7 million total, 5 million came from California and 2 million came from New York. So throw those out and the result is the same. But if you look at Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, each of those states, Joe Biden won those states by between 10 and 13,000 votes. If 44,000 people across those 3 states had voted differently in 2020, Donald Trump would be president right now. So it was not a margin of 7 million votes. It was a margin of about 44,000 votes across 3 states, which is terrifying, legitimately terrifying. The third is Jeffrey Clark. Defendants and co-conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations and to send letters to targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome in those states. So this is Trump and Jeffrey Clark trying to replace the acting attorney general and the acting deputy attorney general because Bill Barr had resigned in December of 2020 because Jeffrey Clark had drafted a letter that he wanted to send to these 7 states, basically putting the weight and the imprimatur, if that's the word, or the authority of the federal government and the Department of Justice behind claims that voter fraud had taken place in those states, and those states should not certify their vote or their electoral slate. The fourth one, the defendant and co-conspirators, and this has got John Eastman all over it, and Trump, attempted to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role on January 6th at the certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results. They wanted Pence to use the fake electors. That was plan A. And then if that didn't work, then reject legitimate electoral votes from states or send legitimate electoral votes back to state legislatures for further investigation rather than actually counting them. And Pence never agreed to go along with any of this. And when that failed on the morning of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud on the ellipse January 6th that morning because Trump spoke, Giuliani spoke, John Eastman spoke. Repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud to the gathered supporters, falsely told them the vice president had the authority to and might alter the election results, and directed them to walk to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceeding and exert pressure on the vice president to take the fraudulent actions that he had previously refused to do. None of that worked. Mike Pence still wouldn't do it. After it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that Pence was not going to do that, Donald Trump sent a tweet saying that Mike Pence wouldn't do it. As violence ensued, and that's when everybody's like, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. As the violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators exploited the disruption by redoubling efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to delay further certification based on those claims. Now, page 6, paragraph 11, there's a header. The defendant's knowledge of the falsity of his election claims. The defendant and his co-conspirators and their agents made knowingly false claims that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 election. This is Giuliani. It's Sidney Powell. Could be, you could add in Jenna Ellis and that one couple, Joe DeGeneva and his wife Vicky Tensing, who are always on Fox News. You could add Lynn Wood into this one, but they're not included. So the lies of election fraud included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as large numbers of dead, non-resident, non-citizen, or other ineligible voters that had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden. That's Dominion and Smartmatic. You can ask Fox News about Dominion. These claims were false. The defendant knew they were false. In fact, defendant was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by the people on whom he relied for candid advice on important matters and who were best positioned to know the facts. Weirdly, all of them were Republicans. I don't think there's a single Democrat listed in this entire document. These are all his people. Trump deliberately disregarded the truth. For instance, then we get eight separate instances where Trump was informed that there's no evidence for his election fraud claims, and he's like, I'm going to rely on these people. Pence had told him repeatedly that he had seen no evidence of outcome determinative fraud. Senior leaders of the DOJ told Trump on multiple occasions that various allegations of fraud were unsupported by any evidence. Trump's director of national intelligence told him that repeatedly and relied on information from the intelligence community in making that assertion. Then there was a guy named Chris Krebs. Chris Krebs headed the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, C-I-S-A. Chris Krebs was a guy who, as this stuff was developing in November and December, I think it was sometime in maybe early December, he put out a tweet or made a statement that this was the most secure election in the history of the United States of America. And then he got fired over Twitter by Trump. But Chris Krebs told Trump repeatedly there was no evidence. Senior White House attorneys, including his White House counsel, Pat Cipollini, who I frequently refer to as Patsy Baloney, informed Trump on an almost daily basis that there was no evidence of outcome determinative election fraud, and told him in no uncertain terms repeatedly that his presidency would end on Inauguration Day 2021. Senior staffers on Trump's re-election campaign. Lola, knock it off. I'm working here. She heard a noise in the hallway. Senior staffers for his campaign told him repeatedly that there was no evidence. Lola, hey, knock it off. Hey, Lola, other people live here, okay? They're allowed to be in the hallway. Lie down. they also told Trump on November 7th, the day that the election was called for Biden, that he had only a 5 or 10% chance of prevailing. Lola, hey, knock it off. A 5 to 10% chance of prevailing in the election, and that the success was contingent upon Trump winning ongoing vote counts or litigation in the 3 states that I just said: Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, the defendant lost in Arizona, meaning that he had lost the election. And so in Arizona, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, you had Governor Ducey. I mean, that famous image of him signing the election certification, and his phone was ringing, and it was Trump, and he didn't take the call. He signed the election certification. And Rudy Giuliani, we saw the former Speaker of the House for the state of Arizona, a guy named Rusty Bowers, testify to the January 6th committee that he had a conversation with Rudy Giuliani, and Rudy Giuliani is laying out all of this stuff, saying, so we want you to reverse the results of your election. And Rusty Bowers is like, well, what's your evidence? And he's like, well, Giuliani's like, well, we have a lot of theories, but we just don't have the evidence yet. And he was like, what? And then in Georgia, famously, is, you got Trump calling their Secretary of State and hassling him. You got Trump calling the governor, calling the lieutenant governor, or the first one, the Secretary of State, was Brad Raffensperger, and that's the phone call that was recorded and I believe released on January 4th, saying, guys, I just need 11,780 votes. Then state legislatures and other officials. Then we got Giuliani's lawsuits in federal court, blah, blah, blah. The defendant widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew, and in many cases had been informed directly, that they were not true. And then it goes through some of the false claims that he was making. Thousands of dead voters had voted in Georgia. The Secretary of State in Georgia told him that's absolutely false. He asserted that there had been 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. Republican state officials had informed him that that was false. The defendant said that there had been a suspicious vote dump in Detroit, Michigan. A big dump, a big, massive dump. No. He said the same thing about Pennsylvania, but that was... So, okay, so here's something else a lot of people aren't aware of. In a lot of these swing states, purple states, because of gerrymandering, they will have Republican state legislatures, but sometimes a Democratic governor. And so in a lot of these states, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, there's a lot of early voting by mail. The people who count votes are not allowed to even open the envelopes for the early votes until Election Day. They can't open them and count them prior to Election Day, even if they received them a month before. And so a phenomenon that we've seen repeatedly, that we saw repeated in 2020, was Democrats voted early by mail. Republicans voted on Election Day. So by, midnight on Election Day, Donald Trump was winning states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and Arizona. And because they had just started counting the vote by mail early ballots, and that day they had counted all of the in-person Election Day ballots that had been cast by Republicans. Well, overnight in every single one of those states, as they're counting the mail-in ballots, which were predominantly cast by Democrats, Joe Biden took the lead. And that's when Donald Trump started freaking out and saying, you got to stop counting right now. You got to stop the counting. But it's a function of law that Republicans put in place, that you can't count early mail-in ballots before Election Day, specifically to try to sow this kind of confusion and division. It happened overnight, so it must be fraud. Yeah. He claimed that there had been tens of thousands of people who voted twice in Nevada. No evidence for that. He claimed that 30,000 non citizens had voted in Arizona. Absolutely no evidence for that. He asserted repeatedly that Dominion and Smartmatic voting machines had switched votes from Trump to Biden. Absolutely no evidence for that. Now, we get to the conspiracy part, the criminal agreement and acts to affect the object of the conspiracy. So look at this, look at that sentence in terms of everybody who's screaming about the First Amendment and expressive conduct. The criminal agreement and acts to affect the object of the conspiracy. The object of the conspiracy was to keep Trump in power. It was not to express through speech or conduct their feelings about the 2020 election. It was conduct that was designed for a specific goal, to keep Trump in office. The first one, defendants' use of deceit to get state officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes. This was their pressure campaign on state officials. And yeah, so they started with Arizona. Because remember that Fox News was the first network to call Arizona for Trump. And when that happened, everybody was like, oh shit, he lost Arizona. This could be bad. And Trump threw a fit. His campaign threw a fit. Even the Fox News personalities threw a fit. They all tried to get that guy in the back office to reverse his decision on Arizona. And he was like, nah, I'm not switching it, man. It's solid. And it was solid. He was right. And let me see if there's anything here I need. So let's get to Arizona. And we go state by state here through this section. So, and some of this involved some of his campaign people, like his campaign manager, Bill Stepien. So Trump and Giuliani called Rusty Bowers, the Arizona Speaker of the House, on November 22nd and made knowingly false claims of election fraud aimed at interfering with the ascertainment of and voting by Arizona's electors. They falsely asserted substantial numbers of non-citizens, non-residents, dead people had voted fraudulently. But had no evidence in support of it. They basically demanded that Rusty Bowers call the legislature into session and hold a hearing based on their claims of election fraud. Rusty Bowers said no. They demanded that Rusty Bowers use the legislature to circumvent the process by which legitimate electors would be ascertained and those votes given to Biden, and replace those with a new slate of electors for Trump. He said no. About 10 days later, Giuliani met with Rusty Bowers. And when Mr. Bowers asked Giuliani for evidence of the outcome determinative election fraud that he and Trump had been claiming, Giuliani responded with words to the effect of, well, we don't have the evidence, but we have a lot of theories. Cool. A couple days later, on December 4th, Rusty Bowers issued a public statement saying these guys are full of it. We're not doing this. We swore an oath, and we're gonna abide by that oath, and we're not gonna throw out the votes of all of our constituents. On the morning of January 4th, John Eastman called Rusty Bowers to urge him to use the majority of the legislature to decertify the state's legitimate electors. He said no. And he's like, give me evidence. Give me evidence. And John Eastman said, well, we don't know enough about the facts on the ground, but just do it and let the courts sort it out. And again, Rusty Bowers refused, saying, I'm not going to do this. And once this stuff was made public, Rusty Bowers and his wife have been married forever. He's been a Republican his entire life. So is his wife. They had I believe two adult kids at the time, and one of whom was their daughter who was living with them because she was dying from terminal cancer. While their daughter was at home with them dying from cancer, uh, pro Trump protesters would protest at his house 24/7 and scream the most horrific things you can possibly imagine at him, at his wife, at his family, because he refused to overturn, because he abided by his oath and refused to overturn the state's election results without any evidence. That's the kind of stuff they did to these people. On January 6th, Trump, at his speech at the Ellipse, publicly repeated the knowingly false claim that 36,000 non citizens had voted in Arizona. All right, that takes us to Georgia. Everybody doing good? Everybody need a stretch? Let's all take a stretch. Here we go. Georgia, on November 16th, on defendant's behalf, his executive assistant, Molly Michael, sent to Sidney Powell, oh boy, and others a document containing bullet points critical of certain voting machine company, writing, "See attached, please include as is or almost as is in the lawsuit." They were going to file a lawsuit. Sidney Powell responded 9 minutes later to everybody in all caps, "It must go in all lawsuits in Georgia and Pennsylvania immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside in those states and in other states." Then she filed a lawsuit against the governor of Georgia alleging massive fraud, which Donald Trump immediately retweeted. So, hey, guys, come on. Trump did this, that retweet, despite the fact that when he had discussed with Sidney Powell her far-fetched public claims regarding Dominion and Smartmatic in private with others, Trump had conceded that her claims were unsupported and that Sidney Powell sounded crazy. Her lawsuit in Georgia was dismissed on December 7th. On December 3rd, Giuliani, so this is when he starts his little tour around the nation, having these fake hearings, many of which were held in hotels with state legislators. On December 3rd, Giuliani orchestrated a presentation to the Judiciary Subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate with the intention of misleading state senators into blocking the ascertainment of legitimate electors. He said 10,000 dead people voted in Georgia. That number turned out to be less than 10. Okay, so this is where Rudy's defamation lawsuit begins. Defamation against him. On December 3rd, to this committee, he played a misleading excerpt of a video recording of ballot counting at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta and insinuated that it showed election workers counting suitcases of illegal ballots. So this is where Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman entered the discussion. Two volunteer election workers, a mother and daughter, African-American women, who were volunteers. And Rudy pinned the entire election fraud thing on them in ways that almost destroyed their entire lives. John Eastman also encouraged state legislators to decertify the state's legitimate electors based on false allegations of election fraud. So they were doing this stuff state by state by state by state. It was crazy. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. So the one important thing here left for Georgia. On December 8th, a senior campaign advisor who spoke with Trump on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were untrue. I'm guessing this is his campaign manager, Bill Stepien. He expressed frustration to Trump that many of Giuliani and his legal team's claims could not be substantiated. he wrote in an email, when our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by, and I love this name, our elite strike force legal team. That's the name they gave Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis. The elite strike force legal team. You can see why we're 0 for 32 in our lawsuits. I will obviously hustle to help on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy bullshit beamed down from the mothership. Then also in Georgia, Mark, it's something that people have forgotten. Mark Meadows went to Georgia to go and observe some of the vote counting, and I think Georgia did at least 2 recounts, one by hand. And Mark Meadows went down to observe that on December 23rd. He went to observe the signature verification process at the Cobb County Civic Center and notified defendant that everything was going well and that if there was any fraud, it would be discovered. And to which Trump responded by tweeting that the Georgia officials. So Mark Meadows called him and said, "These are great people. They're doing a great job. If there's any fraud, they'll find it." Trump responded to that by tweeting that the Georgia officials administering the signature verification process were trying to hide evidence of election fraud and were terrible people. So what is replete throughout this entire document is somebody calls Donald Trump and says, "This piece of paper is white." And he tweets out, "This piece of paper is black and it stole the election and these are horrible people." It's like somebody tells him one thing and he tweets out or he yells out or communicates or whatever the complete absolute opposite of what he's just been told by people within his campaign, people within his administration. It's lie after lie after lie after lie after lie. In a phone call, let me see if that's important. No. So another thing. So there was another lawsuit that was being filed in Georgia against the governor, Brian Kemp. On December 31st, Trump signed a verification affirming false election fraud allegations made on his behalf in a lawsuit filed against Georgia's governor. And John Eastman acknowledged in an email, put it in writing, that Trump had been made aware that a lot of the allegations that were in this lawsuit were false. And when you sign a verification for a lawsuit, it's a statement under the penalty of perjury that everything in the lawsuit is true to the best of your knowledge. So one more lie. And then we get to January 2nd, 4 days before January 6th. That was the date that Trump made his phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. And I heard somebody describe it the other day, and I thought it was perfect. It was an hour-long phone call, and it consisted of Donald Trump talking for 55 minutes. But again, he referred to Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman as professional vote scammers, a vote hustler. I think he said Shay Moss. He said one of their names like 20 times during the phone call. And so I was kind of hoping that they would sue him for defamation as well. Trump said that paper ballots were being destroyed, 5,000 dead people voted, thousands of out-of-state voters cast ballots in Georgia. And he's like, "You need to find me 11,780 votes. Just retabulate. Just tell people you retabulated and you found me 11,780 votes, blah, blah, blah." That phone call forms the basis for the criminal conspiracy charges that Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis is dealing with right now, and for which we're going to get an indictment from her shortly. Michigan. It's the vote dump thing. He was saying that there was fraud in Detroit because he was leading and then overnight he wasn't. So he did something interesting here. he's trying to get these guys in Michigan to overturn their results. And he invited a delegation of senior Republican lawmakers to the White House to come see him in the White House, to come hang out in the Oval Office with the president. He was trying to get them to influence. He was trying to influence them to overturn their results. And fortunately, those guys hung tough and said, "No, we're not going to do that. There's no evidence of it." Then that brings us to Pennsylvania, uh, which he said so many things about Pennsylvania that were bullshit. Because Trump was leading, by election night. Trump was, for the same reason I said earlier about election day votes versus counting mail-in ballots, Trump was leading Pennsylvania by a significant margin, and then that went away. And so he came out with all kinds of conspiracy theories against Pennsylvania. Then we get to Wisconsin. But Republicans in Wisconsin weren't buying it either. And one of the things about like states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, they had divided governments, meaning like Arizona had a Republican governor, but the Secretary of State was Katie Hobbs, a Democrat, and she's the governor now. Michigan governor was Gretchen Whitmer, and their Secretary of State was a Democrat as well. I can't remember her name, but she was threatened dramatically. Pennsylvania, their Secretary of State and their Attorney General were both Democrats. And so these people stood up to this stuff. So that brings us. Hang on, I gotta grab this. Okay, so now we get to the fake electors. Um, and this process starts in early December, and it's him and Eastman and Cheesebro and Giuliani, but we'll talk about how that kind of narrowed in a minute. And they decided to focus on 7 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And just get fake fraudulent electors to come cast ballots for the Electoral College. Um, and it's interesting how this started. So Trump won Wisconsin by something, or excuse me, in 2020, Biden won Wisconsin by something like 10,000 votes, 10 or 11,000 votes. It was not. It was not a wide margin by any stretch. And there was some litigation going on. There was a recount going on. And so Cheesebro writes a memo on November 18th because so election day was what, November 3rd. They called the results on November 7th. All across the nation, in every state, the electors vote on December 14th. So it's like if there's pending litigation that's not resolved by December 14th, and then it works out the other way, well, then who are the electors? And so this whole fake electors thing started off in a way that, kind of sounds like a reasonable contingency plan for the state of Wisconsin. It's like if some of this litigation or goes our way, or if the recount flips the result, but that's not done by December 14th, we need to have an alternate slate of electors in place just in case, so we don't miss that deadline. And so he drafts, Cheesebro drafts, he's co-conspirator number 5. He drafts a memo on November 18th that was conditional. The language in it was conditional. It said, if this, if that, then these are Wisconsin's electors. And because it had that conditional language in it, which Pennsylvania used, the Republicans in Pennsylvania used this, so the Republicans and the fake electors in Pennsylvania are not going to get charged with any crimes because they had that conditional language in there. Then that November 18th memo, the Wisconsin memo, morphs by December 6th into the fraudulent elector memo when it starts blowing into an entire conspiracy across these 7 states. And it says this memo, the fraudulent elector memo, marked a sharp departure from the earlier Wisconsin memo. Now, which advocated just preserving rights in the state of Wisconsin. Now it's the fraudulent elector memo suggested that Trump's electors in 6 purportedly contested states should meet and vote and designate themselves as electors anyway, even though there was no litigation or recounts or anything like that going on. Then 3 days later, Cheesebro writes the fraudulent elector instructions memo, where it's a specific set of instructions for these fake electors in 7 states, saying you have to meet at this place on this date at this time and do this, and here's this form and fill this out. It was just a checklist of instructions, which most of them tried to do. I can't remember if it was Michigan or Wisconsin, but we've all seen the video of the fake electors showing up at the state house on December 14th, and the state troopers not letting them in, saying you're not getting into the building. And so they go through all of that stuff. They get these fake elector slates. I'm going to skip over this stuff just because I'm 45 minutes into this and I'm barely halfway through this document. They get these fake electors for all of these states, and they filled out these fraudulent elector designation documents, and then they mailed them. They mailed them to the National Archives. They mailed them to the President of the Senate, which is wire fraud and mail fraud. On December 14th, all of the legitimate electors across the country got together and voted, and all of these fake electors in 7 states did the same thing. And it's funny, at a couple of points during this process, Trump and his people, including Cheesebro and Eastman, lied to the fake electors. They lied to him, just flat out lied to him, manipulated him, treated him like rubes, which I always get a kick out of. All right, so that brings us to the next one. Trump's attempt to take over the Department of Justice. This is it's crazy. So the election was November 3rd, 2020. I think it was right around Christmas time in December of 2020 that Bill Barr resigned because he could see what was coming and he didn't want any part of it. He'd been telling Trump for 6 weeks, there's no evidence of election fraud. FBI can't find it. DOJ can't find it. It doesn't exist. You lost. And he's like, and bye-bye. I'm out. So that's when Trump, he puts in as the acting attorney general a guy named Jeffrey Rosen. And then his acting deputy was a guy whose last name I think was Donahue. And those two were telling Trump exactly the same thing. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. DOJ can't find it. We've investigated everything. FBI can't find it. They've investigated everything. There's no evidence of any widespread outcome determinative election fraud. And so enter Jeffrey Clark. Google his name. Google Jeffrey Clark Trump DOJ or something like that. He's just this mousy, nerdy-looking little bald guy with bad glasses, who I think he was connected with Trump through Republican Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry, who is a total insurrectionist and thereafter got his cell phone seized by the DOJ because of all of his text messages to and from Mark Meadows and others. But he's this mousy little guy who was an environmental attorney at the DOJ. He ran their environmental department, their environmental law department. He'd certainly never litigated any election cases. or anything even remotely close to this. But Scott Perry goes to Trump and like, this guy will do what you want him to do if you make him the acting attorney general. And so Trump had been trying to get the DOJ to back up his claims of election fraud, and they wouldn't do it. Rosen wouldn't do it. Donahue wouldn't do it. His White House counsel wouldn't back him on any of that stuff either. So he was getting frustrated. On December 22nd, Trump meets with Jeffrey Clark at the White House. Jeffrey Clark did not inform the acting attorney general or the deputy acting attorney general of his meeting, which was a violation of Justice Department's written policy regarding contacts with the White House to guard against improper political influence. On December 26th, Jeffrey Clark spoke with the acting attorney general and lied about the circumstances of his meeting with Trump, falsely claiming that the meeting had been unplanned. And Jeffrey Rosen was like, dude, that you're not allowed to meet with Trump at the White House. Don't do that again. You're not allowed to have contact with him. I'm the only one that's allowed to have contact with him. Don't do that again. The next morning, December 27th, Jeffrey Clark spoke with Trump on the phone for several minutes. Then that afternoon, Trump calls Jeffrey Rosen and Donahue, the acting attorney general and deputy attorney general, and say, people tell me Jeffrey Clark is great and that I should put him in. And then he raised multiple false claims about election fraud. And they pushed back on Trump, and he's like, guys, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republicans in Congress. Which I think was in Donahue's handwritten notes that we saw during the J6 hearing. Then on December 28th, the next day, Jeffrey Clark drafts a letter that he wants the AG and the deputy AG to sign. It's a letter to Georgia saying we've identified significant concerns with the election and you need to put a halt to everything. And they're like, no, dude, we're not signing this. Absolutely not. And stop having contact with the White House, dude. Then on New Year's Eve, Trump brings Rosen and Donahue and says, I'm gonna swap out leadership at the Justice Department. Then on January 2nd, 4 days before January 6th, Jeffrey Clark, who's an underling to these two guys at the DOJ, he tried to blackmail him. He tried to coerce Rosen and Donahue to sign the letter to Georgia, which contained false statements. He told them that Trump was going to make him the new acting attorney general, but that Clark would decline that offer if Rosen and Donahue would sign the letter. So he tried to fucking blackmail. Tried to blackmail his two bosses. And they're like, no, we're not doing that, dude. The next morning on January 3rd, that's not important. Okay. Clark meets with Trump and accepted Trump's offer to become the acting attorney general. That afternoon on January 3rd, Trump, that afternoon, well, no, wait a minute. Let me find this one part. So he's talking, Clark is talking to White House counsel, and White House counsel is like, there's no evidence for election fraud. If you send these letters out, it's going to be insane. And that if Trump remains in office beyond January 20th, there would be riots in every major city in the United States. And Jeffrey Clark, the mousy, nerdy little guy drunk on power, says, well, that's why we have an insurrection act, which would allow Trump to put the military in the streets of American cities. On the evening of January 3rd, Trump met with acting Attorney General, uh, Deputy Attorney General Donahue, met Jeffrey Clark, Justice Department attorneys, Office of Legal Counsel, White House counsel, Deputy White House counsel, and some senior advisors. And all of those guys said, if you put Jeffrey Clark in charge of the Department of Justice and go through with this stuff, we're all quitting. Every one of us, we're all quitting immediately. And Trump had the sense to realize that's bad. But for some reason, Trump also made very clear at that meeting that nobody in that room should be talking to the vice president because he's talking to the vice president, which brings us to number 4, Trump's attempts to enlist Pence to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding. This is all John Eastman and Donald Trump. Donald Trump was pressuring Pence daily, several times a day. And it's in this section that begins on page 32 where it becomes incredibly apparent just how much Mike Pence testified to in front of Jack Smith's grand jury. I mean, he gave them copies of his notes that he took during meetings with Trump. There were multiple phone calls where it was only Trump and Pence on the line, and the indictment contains quotes from those phone calls, meaning that they didn't get that information from Trump, so they got it from Pence. But the important part from this section is that it started in mid-December, and shortly after that was when Trump tweeted out, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." And Trump, Eastman, Clark, Giuliani, and all of the other people who were meeting in the war room at the hotel across the street, I can't remember the name of it, Bannon, Steve Bannon, the Overstock.com guy, Bernie Carrick, Mark Meadows was at some of those meetings, Roger Stone. Bannon and Stone, had security provided, and Flynn had security provided by the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. There's going to be a pipeline from the Oval Office through that war room to the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers regarding coordinating violence for January 6th. They were all expecting violence on January 6th. On January 5th, Steve Bannon went on his podcast and said, tomorrow's not going to go the way you think it's going to. All hell is going to break loose. It is not going to go the way you want it to, or the way you think it's going to. Steve Bannon knew that there was going to be violence on January 6th, period. They're going to find out why at some point. Jack Smith's gonna. I would not want Jack Smith on my trail for anything, ever. He's going to find out why. So it goes through this whole pressure campaign, mainly from Trump, on directly to Pence. But it details a lot of this stuff. I mean, it's a lot of conversations. They have a lot of notes, but Mike Pence just keeps refusing to reject valid electoral votes, refusing to dispute valid electoral votes, refusing to accept fraudulent electoral votes, refusing to send it back to the states, refusing to send it down to Congress. And it all culminates, and Trump is tweeting the whole time, Pence has the power to do this, Pence has the power to do this, Pence has the power to do this. And there was one statement, here we go, paragraph 99. Paragraph 97 on page 36. Trump and Pence met alone. But Jack Smith knows what happened at that meeting because Pence told him. Pence again told him, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing it. That was on January 5th. They spoke several times that day. They met, and one of the things that Trump said to Pence at that meeting is like, "Well, I'm going to have to publicly criticize you." Then Pence leaves that meeting, tells his chief of staff Mark Short, and Mark Short was concerned for the vice president's safety the following day and alerted Pence's Secret Service detail. And then, knowing that over the course